This video is brought to you by Nebula. Starmer is not a popular guy at the moment. 5 months into his term, the UK Prime Minister's approval ratings have plummeted, and he's even had to reset some of his key targets. To make matters worse, last Thursday, a bombshell voting intention tracker was published by the polling company Find Out Now, showing that Reform UK had overtaken Labour for the first time ever. These results showed that 26% of people surveyed said they'd vote Conservative if an election were held tomorrow, 24% said they'd vote Reform UK, and 23% said they'd vote Labour. So in this video, we're going to take a look at what's happened since the 2024 general election, why UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer is so unpopular, and what this means going forward. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. First though, let's start by recapping the 2024 general election and what's happened since. Essentially, despite one of their largest victories since Margaret Thatcher, the Conservatives really struggled in government after 2019. Prime Minister Boris Johnson presided over a number of scandals, most notably Partygate, and their standing in the polls began to take a hit. Meanwhile, Labour, who had just elected the former shadow Brexit Secretary Keir Starmer as their leader, were enjoying something of a resurgence. After Johnson's downfall, both of these trends continued further. Truss damaged the Tories' credibility on the economy and worsened factionalism, and Starmer continued to reform Labour, dragging it to the centre. By the time of the 2024 election, the Tories were around 20 points behind Labour in the polls, and come election day itself, Labour secured themselves the second largest majority in their history. Things since the election, though, have been far from rosy. Starmer has been embroiled in a number of different scandals, seriously damaging his credibility and his favourability among the electorate. In mid-November, according to data from YouGov, Starmer's net approval rating fell to the lowest of the major party leaders, sitting at -33. Now, this new poll makes things look even worse for Starmer. Conducted by Find Out Now in a survey of 2,607 adults, 26% said they'd vote for the Conservatives, 24% for Reform, and 23% for Labour. This marks a 2-point increase for Reform compared to the week before, a 1-point drop for the Conservatives and a 2-point drop for Labour. However, we should point out that the methodology used by this company differs from that of other pollsters, which explains why the support for Labour is lower in this one compared to others. The Find Out Now survey first asks people if they would vote, and if not, excludes them. This results in a lower Labour projection because of 3 factors. Labour voters are less likely to say they'll vote. Labour voters are less likely to stick with their party, and Labour voters are more likely to say they don't know how they would vote. Anyway, this brings us on to the main part of our video. Why is Starmer so unpopular? We've got broadly 3 main ideas here, but if you've got any more, we'd love to hear about them in the comments. First up is Starmer's struggles on the economy. We recently made a full video on this, which you should watch if you want more detail. But to recap briefly, the latest ONS data covering July to September this year shows that GDP rose by just 0.1% and actually contracted in the month of September. This was well down from the 0.7% growth we saw in the first quarter of 2024 and the 0.5% we saw in the second quarter. Moreover, GDP per capita today remains at 0.7% below its pre-pandemic level, with the only other G7 economies in this position being Germany and Canada, where GDP per capita is still about 2% below pre-pandemic levels. This has been particularly bad for Starmer, given that probably Labour's most recognisable campaign pledge was growth. Lower than expected GDP growth means lower than expected tax revenues, which means more emergency borrowing, which means higher levels of public debt. This has actually already begun to happen. In August, according to ONS data, the government had to borrow £13.7 billion, about £2.5 billion more than forecast, taking the UK's overall public debt to GDP ratio to over 100% for the first time since the 1960s. Second is Starmer's struggles politically, i.e. his communications both as Prime Minister and within his own administration. Starmer's messaging about various policy initiatives has seemed confused at times. It seems that whenever the Prime Minister gets frustrated about his lack of movement in the polls, he just calls a press conference and tries to explain to the electorate exactly what his priorities for government are. The issue is, he's just done this too many times, to the point that his aims and objectives have been obscured. We've included this flowchart from journalist Max Kendicks to show you just how unclear this is. Right now, Starmer has 3 foundations, 5 missions, 6 first steps, 6 milestones, 7 pillars, and 8 growth sectors. On its own, this might not be too much of an issue. However, Starmer has also struggled to convey a positive message since he became Prime Minister. When he spent months warning the electorate that the budget would be painful, this just ended up creating a sense that things weren't going well under Labour. In a sense, this is the opposite to Prime Ministers like Boris Johnson, or even, to an extent, Tony Blair, who tried to project a sense of British optimism. This brings us to our final point, which is Starmer's general perception by the UK public. We recently did a podcast on this, which you might want to check out. But essentially, Starmer just doesn't have good vibes. In September, a survey by Savanta asked 2,000 people to give one word to describe Keir Starmer, with the outstanding choice being liar, followed much more positively by good and strong, but then by useless, idiot, weak and boring. It's this last adjective that opposition figures have often tried to capitalise on, and in summer 2022, Starmer reportedly even asked his then shadow cabinet to stop briefing the press that he's boring, in a meeting described by one Labour frontbencher as, ironically, very boring. Now, that might sound like a relatively minor thing. After all, Prime Ministers are primarily responsible for managing their cabinet and party, which Starmer seems to be coping with fairly well. However, it obviously does matter when elections come around, and Labour will be wary of losing more voters to parties like Reform. While some of the issues we've seen so far, like the freebie scandal and mixed messaging, could conceivably be forgiven as teething problems, Labour will have to prove to the UK public that they have delivered economic growth, which is likely to remain Starmer's biggest challenge. Finally, with Trump in office in the US and a much more fractured European Parliament, Starmer's leadership not just within the UK, but also the world stage, will be something to watch closely. As you've probably noticed, the news cycle is particularly fast right now, with coups, elections and governmental gossip happening all over the world. In fact, with Trump heading into the White House, that chaos is only likely to get worse. If you're feeling a little lost and even a little depressed, then you might want to check out our series WTF USA, where we explain everything that's happened across the pond in the land of the free. Because while the election might be over, the number of WTF moments only looks likely to increase. Unlike some of our other more serious videos, the tone of WTF USA is more light-hearted and takes something of an irreverent look at what's going on. Regular viewers will be pleased to hear that the series has been extended due to overwhelmingly popular demand over on Nebula.
If these trends continue, hey!
Now, if you didn't know, Nebula is an independent creator-owned streaming platform that specialises in thoughtful content. Over there, you can find creators like Wendover Productions, Real Life Law, and Legal Eagle, with many of them releasing their very own original series on the platform. We're super proud of WTF USA, and we hope that with your support, we'll be able to make other interesting, weird, and entertaining series with Nebula in the future. So signing up genuinely helps TLDR to grow and expand. You can also watch every normal TLDR video on Nebula ad-free, and in some instances before they land on YouTube. If you're not a member already, then click our link in the description to get 40% off. That's just $30 a year or $2.50 a month. We really hope you check out the series, and as always, thanks for your support.